the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. In September, voters in Scotland will participate in a unique referendum. They will decide whether or not Scotland should secede from the United Kingdom and become its own independent country. Supporters of the referendum, led by advocacy group Yes Scotland, say that Scotland should have greater control over what goes on within its borders, like how its tax revenues are spent and how its economic policies are crafted. Those against the referendum, led by advocacy group Better Together, say Scotland would struggle to exist as an independent country, and the benefits associated with being part of the UK, such as a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, outweigh those of being separate. Today on Global Journalist, we'll look at the upcoming referendum, as well as the economic and social reasons that are driving this discussion forward. I'm joined today by David Torrance, a freelance journalist who wrote The Battle for Britain, Scotland and the Independence Referendum, David Nicholson, a freelance journalist who has written for Forbes on the referendum, and David Cameron, professor of political science and director of EU studies at Yale University. And gentlemen, I'd like to thank all of you for being on Global Journalist today. David Torrance, I'd like to start with you. In your estimation and based on what you've seen, what is it that the pro-independence folks are after? What is the main issue that is driving this referendum discussion forward?
I think there's no single issue. It's a combination of several factors. For some Scottish voters, it's simply a sort of instinct. They instinctively believe that Scotland used to be independent and therefore it ought to be independent again. There's another section of the electorate who believe that the UK, the United Kingdom, is no longer operating in Scotland's favour, and that for economic and social reasons, an independent Scotland would do a better job of managing the economy, welfare, and so on. And for a smaller but quite lively section, artists and writers and quite creative individuals, they see independence as the ultimate creative act, a new start as a country. And they think in terms of imagination, that would be a good thing. So it's not any single issue. It's several different factors which all overlap.
And David Nicholson, the referendum that's being presented to Scottish voters is a simple yes or no question. Should Scotland be an independent country? Is this, in your opinion, the best way that this discussion should be held, as a simple yes-no issue?
Well, it's going to get a lot of people out of the woodwork and get them to say whether they are truly in favour of staying in the Union or not. I think the trouble is that a lot of Scottish people would have liked a third option, which is broadly known as Devo Max, where they would get far more autonomy over issues like their economy than they have now, without actually separating into a separate state. So it's a difficult question to address because they haven't got a lot of the people haven't got the question they would want. And I understand that includes Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, who himself would have preferred to have that. But the more extreme members of his own party were unprepared to go along with that. And the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, and the other members of the Westminster government were also unprepared to let Scotland have that choice. So, we're going to see something that may result in that greater autonomy if people vote no, but we won't see it if they vote yes. So that's a sort of paradoxical arrangement where you may get more than you want as a Scot if you vote yes.
And David Nicholson, why do you think that people would have preferred the Devo Max option to full-on independence?
Well, because there are so many very great advantages in staying part of the Union. You referred to the seat on the Security Council. That's just one of the very many things that people who, like me, would like to see Scotland remain part of the Union are arguing. The economic benefits of being part of the sixth largest economy in the world are very clear to see. That Scotland has most of its trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. Why would you want to create barriers to that? We've spent decades, centuries getting closer links. having more trade, more, freer trade, and all the advantages that come with the stuff that Adam Smith, one of the greatest ever Scots, identified as the way to prosperity, which is to have this sort of ability to replicate and not having to reinvent the wheel. That's going against all that. It's saying we just want to stick to our own little patch, and it would certainly, in my view, be economically problematic.
David Cameron, I'd like to turn to you. I'd like to first stress that you are a professor at Yale and not the British Prime Minister who happens to share the same name as you. But, excuse me, what challenges in your eyes would an independent Scotland face? What sort of economic issues would this new country have to deal with? How would it fit in on the international stage?
Well, one of the points, just to pick up on the last point, roughly 70% of Scotland's trade, its exports are with the UK. So this runs the risk of introducing transaction costs if Scotland is independent. The financial system in Scotland is exceptionally large relative to the GDP. The assets are something on the order of 13 times the GDP of Scotland. And that poses two problems. First, if one of those banks fails, it would be an enormous drain on resources in Scotland. Probably more importantly, RBS, Lloyd's might move to London. The financial center might relocate more fully than it has already. A major issue, it seems to me, is the currency, and it's one in which the SNP has, I think, taken a position that contradicts its support for independence, because it is advocating maintaining the pound sterling and doing that by a currency union with the UK. The UK rejects that idea. Among other things, as former Prime Minister Major said, this would require the UK to underwrite Scottish debt. But it also contradicts the idea of independence, because it would mean basically that Scottish monetary policy would be controlled by the Bank of England. And it would also mean that inevitably the UK would be controlling or influencing fiscal policy in Scotland, perhaps requiring that taxes be increased and spending be reduced in somewhat similar ways to what we've seen in the Eurozone. There's another major issue beyond, but related to this, which of course is the question of EU membership. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at this point or later, but the SNP hopes to get full membership without having to renegotiate and without having to commit itself to going into the euro. But in fact, it will have to go into the euro, and it will have to renegotiate. And there are some countries, most notably Spain, which faces its own referendum in Catalonia in November, which has already gone on the record as saying that it would oppose Scottish membership.
And I do want to talk about the ramifications of Scotland's independence with respect to the EU. But first, I'd like to remind you that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We're looking at the upcoming Scottish independence referendum and how it could impact the area's future. I'm joined today by David Torrance, a freelance journalist who wrote The Battle for Britain, Scotland and the Independence Referendum. David Nicholson, a freelance journalist who has written for Forbes on the referendum. And David Cameron, professor of political science and director of EU studies at Yale University. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That is globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. David Cameron, I'd like to get back to the EU issue. You've said that Spain is already saying that they are opposed to the idea of an independent Scotland joining the EU because of their own separatist issues. What about Scotland perhaps joining the United Nations? Do you think there's more of a chance that it would be able to gain acceptance there, and then from there perhaps get a foothold into other organizations like NATO, like the EU?
I think that would be less difficult to negotiate, and an independent Scotland would be welcome in the UN. Obviously, it wouldn't. It would have no claim to the UK seat on the Security Council. I think NATO would be difficult in part because of the SNP's reluctance until quite recently, until 2012, to support NATO membership, and in particular its commitment to remove nuclear weapons, which means removing the Trident from nuclear submarines with missiles, obviously, from Scotland, and to create a defense that would be little more than a home guard. I think, and George Robertson and others have made it very clear that the SNP proposals for defense fall far short of what NATO would want and expect. So I think that's an issue.
Okay. David Torrance, I'd like to turn to you now. You commute often from Edinburgh to London and back and forth. How have you seen people reacting to this issue based on where you are? Are the attitudes toward the referendum different in London and in the rest of the UK than they are in Scotland?
Yeah, it varies. I mean, London is increasingly a bit of a city-state. You know, it's not part of England in many respects, let alone the rest of the UK. And in London, which is full of Scots, it's full of people from most countries, they're not terribly interested. To summarise the wider English viewpoint, and of course England is the dominant country in the UK, it ranges from those who have no view to those who think that if Scotland wants to become independent, you know, they wouldn't necessarily be happy about it, but they see no reason to stop them, to others who do feel quite strongly about retaining the Union and value its component national identities and national units. Indeed, a group just a couple of days ago released a video featuring celebrities, sportsmen and prominent figures from Northern Ireland, Wales and England saying to Scotland, don't go. Very much echoing a campaigning trick used in the Quebec referendum in Canada back in 1995 where figures from the rest of Canada said to Quebec, don't go. So there are a range of views, just as there are a range of views in Scotland about what should happen in constitutional terms.
David Nicholson, do you think that if the referendum in Scotland were to succeed, or that Scottish voters would eventually be able to get more devolution of powers, more independence for them, would we see other more nationalist regional parties like Plaid Cymru in Wales perhaps agitate for more of that type of influence over their own government?
I think we will, and I think we'll also see more cities in the UK having the same independence, or at least more autonomy wishes, and that's something that we've actually encouraged in terms of the UK government has encouraged more cities to elect their own mayors, as we have in London now. Some cities have refused the option, thinking that it wouldn't actually help them very much, Newcastle being one example. But I think it would give impetus to independence movements. The Cornish are quite keen on greater autonomy, the Welsh certainly, and you know, who knows, it may go into even more granular questions of local government and areas. And I think that those questions are perfectly relevant to be asked and to be debated. Whether that it has to be independence for Scotland that prompts that isn't my view. I'd prefer it to be a debate about how we are governed and the responsibility that we have for our local areas.
David Nicholson, do you think that to a certain extent this may come down to a matter of personality, that voters who put in the SNP and wanted Alex Salmond's leadership in the Scottish Parliament will support him just because they like him and therefore they'll like supporting the referendum? Or do you think that it's a much broader issue than that?
I think it will be the Clinton phrase, it's the economy stupid. It will come down to, am I going to be poorer? And I think that will carry the referendum, because the great weight of opinion is coming down on the side that, it really isn't stacking up economically, as Professor Cameron made a number of points that, the financial sector and the trade with the rest of the UK and so on. So I think that will sway it. I think there will be a hardcore of people who say, I don't care if I'm going to be poorer, I'm just going to vote with my instinct, with my gut. I am prepared to be poorer, but I'll be master of my own fortune. But I don't think that will be enough. And certainly I don't find Salmond, from any point of view, an inspiring character. I don't quite know how he managed to get where he is, but there we are. He's got some kind of electoral trick or attraction. I don't think it will be enough, though.
Now, on the economic issue, one of the points that the pro-yes side has been stating is that they see Scotland as being the new Norway in terms of population size, in terms of revenue that comes from oil money from the North Sea. They look at Norway as an economic model to emulate were they an independent country. David Cameron, do you think that that is a fair comparison to make, and do you think that it's one that's justifiable?
I think it's about 40 years too late. The problem is that the North Sea reserves are draining down and inexorably draining down, and Scotland has not accumulated, because it didn't have control over the revenues coming from the North Sea in the peak production periods. It doesn't have the huge sovereign wealth fund that Norway has, that is by far the largest single equity owner in Europe. So this is sort of a pipe dream to imagine that Scotland, whenever it does become independent, would be able to have the same wonderful experience that Norway has had, where, for example, just to cite a statistic, recently Norway reported that its budget surplus relative to GDP was 15%. No other country in Europe has anything close to that, as we know. And it's unrealistic to think that Scotland would ever be there. So I think it's an illusion and not a reality in the future, in the event the yes vote wins.
David Torrance, do you think that voters in Scotland are buying that argument that Scotland could be the next Norway, or are they seeing through it?
Some, particularly on the left in Scotland, find it a very attractive vision. And it's dominated Scottish political discourse since the 1980s, since the earlier debates for devolution, for the establishment of a Scottish Parliament, as of course there was in 1999. The idea that Scotland is already essentially a social democratic country like those in Scandinavia, and Norway is referenced, as is Sweden, Denmark and Finland. It just doesn't really stack up. And in as much as Scottish voters are aware of those other countries, they will be aware that they generally have much higher personal taxation. And that, of course, is to fund a relatively more generous welfare state and social provision. Now, Scots voters like that aspect. They want free and good quality public services, but most of the social attitudes data also shows that they like paying low taxes, as of course do people in the rest of the UK. So some will find it attractive, others will be quite cynical, but most, I suspect, are not really aware of such comparisons. It's a sort of bubble thing. It's for readers of The Economist to take an interest in that. But the wider point is actually that social attitudes in Scotland are not markedly different from those in the rest of the UK. There are, of course, variations, but they're usually not very significant ones.
I'd like to remind you that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We are looking at the upcoming Scottish independence referendum and how it could impact the area's future. I'm joined by David Torrance, a freelance journalist who wrote The Battle for Britain, Scotland and the Independence Referendum, David Nicholson, a freelance journalist who has written for Forbes on the referendum, and David Cameron, professor of political science and director of EU studies at Yale University. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website, that is globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. Gentlemen, we're coming toward the close of the program. I'd like to ask for each of your opinions on something. If you feel as though the referendum is not going to pass, or perhaps you feel it is going to pass, what's next for Scotland? If they vote yes, what happens next? If they vote no, perhaps, what do you think happens next? David Nicholson, I'd like to start with you.
If they vote yes, then we're in for a prolonged period of conflict and strife because, as we've already heard in this programme, they haven't got a good plan for the currency. They don't know what they're doing on Europe. And there are numerous other areas where they just haven't done the homework. And so there would be a period of negotiation and bargaining, which wouldn't really help anyone. It would just slow down trade. It would create further conflict. If there is a narrow vote against independence, there will still be a good deal of heartache going on, particularly in some of the areas of Scotland which are very pro-independence. But I would say there will be a brighter future for Scotland. And if, as I wish, there is a convincing victory for the United Kingdom side of the argument, then we can go back to being a collaborative and close family of nations, which is how I've always understood the United Kingdom, and that would be the best outcome.
David Nicholson, do you think that regardless of the result, do you think that the relationship between Scotland and Westminster, or Scotland and the rest of the UK, is going to be strained to levels that we haven't seen before?
Well, only if there's an independence vote or it's very close the other way. Certainly there will be strains. There are already. I mean, the amount of abusive emails and messages I've had, just me as a barely known journalist have had, never mind J.K. Rowling when she came out on the side of the union. There's a lot of pent-up anger there. Now, what we need to do is try and understand that anger. Why is it that certain group of Scottish people and voters feel disenfranchised? And I hope that the Westminster government will do something about that, not just in terms of granting more autonomy through more devolution, but in terms of reconnecting the different parts of this kingdom. And I think, of course, as I said before, if the vote is convincingly against independence, that will be a good option and a good chance for people to reconnect.
David Torrance, what are your thoughts on the matter? Do you think, what do you see comes next for Scotland?
I think if there's a yes vote, and all the polling at the moment makes that look quite uncertain, the No campaign has a pretty good lead. But if there's a yes vote, if the polls narrow as they did in Quebec in '95, and it actually happens, I think in the short term it would be quite disruptive, quite destabilising. There is a lot to unpick. Scotland is in many respects highly integrated with the rest of the UK in terms of welfare and economics. But at the same time, I think it would neither be as bad as some opponents claim it would be, nor as rosy and as successful as some proponents of independence say. I think, as Czechoslovakia shows, as other countries have shown, it is possible. In the short term, it can be very difficult, but in the long term, it could actually work. If there's a no vote, I think the UK government, the Westminster government, and the various parties competing for power there will continue their strategy of sort of piecemeal, ad hoc, largely reactive devolution to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, perhaps a bit more in the cities and regions of England. But I think that approach is subject to the law of diminishing returns, and they have to think in more holistic terms. And I've written and advocated, and admittedly I'm virtually a lone voice in doing this, arguing that the UK should be reconstituted as a federal country, which is, to me, the only way of sort of squaring off the competing aspirations of nationalists and unionists. I think it makes sense intellectually. Whether it will happen in political terms is, of course, a moot point.
And David Cameron, what do you see comes next for Scotland?
Well, I think if you look at the polls, the latest polls show a breakdown of roughly 42% yes, 58% no. That's in the ICM and the TNS polls that came out earlier this month. The positions are hardening, so I think probably it will end up somewhere on the order of 45% yes and 55% no. And the real dilemma and the real problem is, I think once there is a no vote, keeping in mind what is on the agenda for the government in the UK, an election next year, a possible referendum on the EU in 2017 if the current government remains in office. The fact that the governing parties in the UK are a distinct minority in Scotland, my fear is that there will be a no vote, and once that happens, the UK government will forget about Scotland. And whatever devolution we get certainly won't be maximum, and it won't even be a modest amount of devolution. It'll be token devolution. Ultimately, in the longer run, I agree completely that what is required in the UK is a move from unitary government to outright federalism. But I think it's unfortunate. But in some sense, the result is quite predictable, given the fact that the question was constrained the way it was. That if we had had a full referendum that included the question of maximum devolution, that would have won the day, and that might have actually happened. But as it is, I think we'll get a no vote, and then we'll get not much else.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Global Journalist is a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to our guests today, David Torrance, David Nicholson, and David Cameron. Our lead producer this week is Jessica Anania. Travis McMillan from the Reynolds Journalism Institute is our technical director, and Pat Akers of KBIA is our audio engineer. Join us again next time for another edition of Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. Thank you for listening.